And she and John Adams ended up having this extensive back and forth through letters that got quite contentious, got quite heated, really tried their friendship to the point that they were really in this very polite Yankee aristocratic fashion, bluntly dissing each other, saying, look, I'm going to pretend you didn't just say that, and things like that. At the end of the day, they were able to restore their friendship, as I explain in the book. But the warnings that she raised about what we might be doing in creating the federal government were prescient. They were way ahead of their time. And one of the reasons why I included the chapter about her is because if we had heeded the warnings of people like Mercy Otis Warren more fully, if we remembered her today, then I think we'd be a little bit more suspicious of federal power and the extent to which it's taken over everything else. I also wonder about whether we would know more about her had she not said these things. Had she, for instance, been a huge advocate saying it's not going to be a problem, don't worry about it, you don't have a thing to worry about with the new federal government, perhaps her name would be more prominent today than it is. It's one of the reasons why I included her in the book.
If you had been living back then, would you have been a Federalist or an anti-Federalist?
I've always believed that I would be a Federalist, and I still believe that. And the reason is, I think the Constitution as written really did do the job. I wish there had been a couple of additional protections. I would have felt more comfortable had we used the Elbridge-Gerry version of what became the 10th Amendment, rather than the version as stripped down by James Madison, so that it said all powers not expressly granted to Congress, nor prohibited by the Constitution to the states, should be reserved to the states respectively or to the people. If we had gone with it that way, I would have been more comfortable with it, because it would have been more clear what was already the case, that the powers of the federal government are few and defined, and those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. Nonetheless, I think I would have been persuaded by those who said the protections are sufficient. And for 150 years, Mark, they were right. For 150 years. I don't mean to suggest there was a utopian civilization in America, but there was something pretty close to constitutional government that lasted basically into the New Deal era, when we started drifting away from federalism and separation of powers.
Now, in Madison's defense, there'd be no amendments, but for him going to the floor of the House and pestering them in the first Congress.
That's right.
Because they pretty much blew it off, and he wouldn't let them.
He wouldn't let them. And one of the reasons why he wouldn't let them is that he made promises to those who were insisting on a Bill of Rights, promises to people like Luther Martin, like Mercy Otis Warren, and like George Mason, promises to help persuade those people and those who were sympathetic to their arguments that it was okay to ratify. And
because they were losing Massachusetts, they were losing Virginia, and they were losing New York.
That's right.
And they had to make this promise because these amendments really came out of the states.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Now, to his credit, Madison followed through on that promise. He made this promise, and the promise was kept. Madison kept at it, even in the face of great difficulty. It's one of the reasons why I have such reverence for James Madison. Even though I don't agree with everything he said during the Constitutional Convention, he got it to a good place, and he made it an even better place with the Bill of Rights, which he fought so aggressively to have.
In the Federalist Papers, there's never been anything like the Federalist Papers, an exposition of what they were doing and why they did it and what they believed in. And I mean, if people just read the Federalist Papers, and they're really not taught. I was never taught the Federalist Papers. I'm almost 60 years old. The extent I know the Federalist Papers, I read them myself. I don't remember. Were any of you taught about the Federalist Papers? No. Were you taught about the Federalist Papers?
Yes.
That's Utah. That's why.
I was taught about them in my home, but we also discussed them in high school. I went to Timpview High School in Provo, Utah. We talked about them extensively there, and also at BYU.
Well, I should have gone there. But they weren't taught at Temple University, I can tell you that. I wanted to ask you about, on the Constitution side, do you think in many respects we live in a post-constitutional period?
I don't think I would describe it as a post-constitutional
Or
period.
An extra-constitutional
Yes,
period?
definitely in an extra-constitutional period where a lot of government occurs outside of the Constitution. In particular, a lot of the federal government occurs outside of the Constitution. I mean, look, I've got these visual aids I keep in my office. 2 stacks of documents. One is a few inches tall, a few hundred pages long, consists of the laws passed by Congress last year. The other stack is 97,000 pages long. It's 13 feet tall, and it consists of last year's Federal Register. That's the cumulative annual index of federal regulations as they're announced for notice and comment and later finalized. So most of our laws, measured by weight, volume, word count, economic impact, you name it, is now coming through the executive branch bureaucracies outside of the constitutional framework, setting aside the fact that a lot of this stuff occurs outside the realm of what we could properly consider a federal responsibility. It's also de facto legislation that occurs outside the framework of Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, the Legislative Powers Clause, and Article 1, Section 7, the Presentment Clause. It says in order to pass a federal law, you've got to have concurrent passage. You've got to have a passage within the same Congress by the House, by the Senate, and signature by the President or acquiescence.
And all this bypasses that.
All this bypasses that. So yes, we are absolutely living in a time when a whole lot of government activity, especially federal government activity, occurs extra-constitutionally. That is a problem. We can reclaim it.
What do you think these people would think about that?
Oh, they would be appalled by that. First of all, I want to be clear. These people, the 8 forgotten founders who I cover in Written Out of History, I think every one of them, to a person, would be thrilled in many respects with what they see today. They'd be thrilled with the fact that we're still alive, the fact that we're still intact, the fact that we're not flying the Union Jack, we're not subject to a monarch in London, the fact that we have our own government. They would be appalled, I believe, at the amount of governing that has now been taken away from the American people and moved to Washington, D.C. Then within Washington, D.C., that's been outsourced by the people's elected lawmakers and given to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Look, these are smart people, these are wise people, hardworking people, the federal bureaucrats who make these regulations. But there's one problem. They're not constitutionally empowered, and they're therefore not accountable to the people at regular intervals. You don't vote for them, you can't. I can't, nobody can. They're about as removed from the will of the people as anything you can find.
I can't find a single, when I was doing my research on Men in Black, I can't find a single, even quasi-prominent participant in the developing our governing system who would have supported what the courts have become.
Certainly not. In fact, at the time the Constitution was written and undergoing the ratification process, it was referred to accurately, I think, as the least dangerous branch. In many respects, that's still true. But the fact that they're less dangerous than the other two doesn't mean they're not dangerous at all.
Brutus specifically focused in on that.
Yes.
And was very concerned about the courts. He said, I see no limitations. Now, as you know, they don't say a lot about the court, what the court is and so forth, and that's what concerned him. Well, they had a lot of concerns, a lot of these, but they had to come up with their document. And so, where do you think we've gone wrong? I don't mean whether it's separation of powers or that. Do you think the mentality of the nation has changed? Do you think that Wilson and the progressives have won, that basically, at least for now, the government much more reflects their their view, their Hegelian view, their, I won't put this word in your mouth, their more Marxist view when it comes to materialism and historicism. Do you think they have won out right now? We're on defense?
The progressives certainly have gained some very material ground. Woodrow Wilson moved it along. He got some pushback from the courts and to a degree from Congress. FDR, a couple of decades later, shot it through the roof. And what they both fell victim to was the tyranny of the expert.